Good morning. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, God of love. This week has been a dramatic one. It's not every week, thankfully, that war breaks out in Europe. The reports from the Ukraine have been surreal. It still seems to me almost unbelievable that cities not that unlike our own are being bombed. The Ukraine Security Forces is handing out machine guns to volunteers. There are so many stories filtering out about normal people like us, whose lives have suddenly become so crazy. Stories of people preparing to defend their country, and story of women and children fleeing, scared, looking for safety. Just yesterday on the news, I watched women just like me gathering outside in a park to make Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs. Did you see that? Seemingly you have to grate polystyrene. Hardly the Saturday afternoon activity that I imagine they had planned a couple of weeks ago. It seems that peace is totally precarious, and all that we can do is to join people of faith all around the world to pray, to hope that sanctions against the war start to have an effect, and to stand beside the oppressed. People are protesting against the war here and in Russia, but those in Russia are constantly at risk of arrest. The glimpses we have of other countries seem surreal and quite difficult to understand and take in. This week's Gospel reading, the Transfiguration story from Luke, is another fairly surreal story, and one that might be difficult to comprehend. So, let's step back. Jesus, having had a conversation the previous week with the disciples about him being the Messiah and a foretelling of his death and resurrection, drags these three disciples up the hill for that mountaintop prayer experience. And surprise, surprise, they are heavy with sleep while he prays. It was probably a hard climb, and sometimes I think that it must have been pretty hard to keep up with Jesus, so I'm not surprised they were sleepy. These three disciples, Peter, John, and James, get pretty bad press for sleeping on the job, both here and later in the Garden of Gethsemane. This perhaps may point to the disciples, and particularly Peter's, as he is often the spokesperson, to his inability to comprehend Jesus. This in itself is quite reassuring. Dear old Peter, chosen by Jesus, is so totally human and full of mistakes. We can surely take heart that there's room for the rest of us, along with all our flaws and baggage. Anyway, back to the mountaintop. While Jesus prays, he seems to change, and his clothes are described as being dazzling white, just like in that washing powder advert. Apparently, the word used to describe Jesus' dazzling appearance is the same that is used to describe lightning. So, with a flash, the disciples are woken up, but they're still quite sleepy and bewildered, and they see the light of Christ, but they don't really get it. There are suggestions that this vision of Jesus in his glory, here alongside Moses and Elijah, representing the two principal components of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, was an anticipation of the resurrection, or possibly even a resurrection appearance in the wrong place. However, However we see it, it is a glimpse of the glorified, risen Christ. So the disciples are woken up by lightning and somehow work out that Jesus is talking to these two heroes of Judaism, Moses and Elijah. And Peter, God love him, decides he has to do something. He's got to mark the experience. It's important somehow. Just hold it there, Jesus, while I take a photograph. Bunch up a bit. No, back a bit. And then he didn't know what he was saying, and the cloud descended. And the disciples are told in no uncertainty that they are witnessing God's Son. This is not just another bringer of laws like Moses or another great prophet like Elijah. This is God's Son. The events on the mountain are a visual representation of what Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel. From Matthew 5, verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." These three disciples are given a revelation of who Jesus really is. Jesus is not just a good teacher. He is God incarnate. So here, on the mountain, the disciples wake up to see the divine nature of Jesus. And later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the same disciples rise from their slumbers to see the humanity of Jesus as they see him going to his death. But they don't quite get it. The similarity of both stories perhaps suggests the difficulty of understanding just who Jesus is. People describe mountains as places where they can get close to God, perhaps, somewhere to glimpse God, that thin place between heaven and earth. You can certainly see a lot of creation and wonder at the marvel of God from up high. The disciples got their mountaintop experience. It was a temporary event, not meant to be permanent, however. After all, Peter wasn't allowed to build his tents. However, I don't think that we should wait around for our own mountaintop experience. These dramatic flashes of God's glory are incredibly rare. I don't think the story of the Transfiguration is there to tell us that we can have a mountaintop experience of God. I think it's there to show us who God really is. But like the disciples, we often don't realize that we have seen the glory of God revealed. We may find places where we feel we can be particularly close to God, but often sadness, darkness, war, or indeed sleepiness keep us from seeing God glorified. The disciples were told, "This is my son, listen to him." Jesus had been with the disciples all along, but they weren't quite awake enough to see his glory. It was there. They just hadn't seen it. God's issue with me most of the time is not sleepiness, it's busyness. That's what stops me from seeing the glory of God. I don't stop to listen often enough, and I sometimes forget that God is already alongside me. This last week has been a really busy one for me. Paul knows. The sermon was on the to-do list. I had to order and deliver 35 afternoon teas on top of my usual work week. There was a trip to Perth to visit a potential day centre with my dad, and there was planning to be done to celebrate his 90th birthday next month. There were 3 evening meetings, one of which had to be sacrificed as there was a funding application for Amelie's swimming club to write. I was sorry to miss the Living the Questions meeting. I had the usual taxiing of the kids and some German and English homework to help with. And I had a house guest, one of the Iona Island staff members down in Glasgow for training. You don't really need to know all the things that I had to do last week. I'm just looking for some sympathy. No, but when I started to reflect on the rushing around that I thought had been keeping me from seeing God, I began to realise that the glory of God had been visible all along. All I had to do was listen, or rather stop and take stock, which is sort of the same as listening. Seeing the delight on faces of people that I hadn't seen for months as I stood on their doorsteps to deliver afternoon teas. The joy of worshipping together with my Iona Community Family Group, the first time in person for nearly 2 years. Moments with a new friend. Food and conversation shared. Little glimpses of God alongside us, beside us. Sometimes, though, it's hard to stop and listen. Things do have a way of getting in the way. Unfolding war and violence, illness, sadness, worry, bad things, or simply things that distract and make us forget that God is here alongside us. We don't need mountaintop experiences to see God, but we do need to wake up and look and listen in the ordinariness. Today is Transfiguration Sunday, the last Sunday before the contemplative, that's it, and sometimes difficult season of Lent. This is more than the marking of time. It's a movement in a journey, the journey towards Jerusalem. This mountaintop event is not isolated as a standalone story. It's part of a larger story of Jesus crucified, resurrected, and glorified. Let's view this journey of Lent as an invitation to become awake. God's glory is breaking in all around us, all the time. Do we have the eyes to see it? What is keeping you distracted? What is numbing your senses? What is lulling you to sleep? What will it take to become awake? I'll finish with a poem which I think is particularly apt today, and this is a poem by Steve Garnaas Holmes. Excuse me. Listen for the one amid the others, the one who awakes something lovely in you. If you don't turn from this clanging world to listen, you won't hear him. Listen for the voice that calls you beloved, the voice that calls you to love. Listen to the voice that speaks of creation's wholeness, that beckons you to completion. A voice that leads you towards others, not your own rising above and away. Listen to the song of the immense flowering within you, the risk and passion you can dance to. You will hear it in stillness, not in frenzy, in silence, not in noise. You will hear it from those who are belittled, not those who are honoured by this besotted world. The beloved will not speak of success, but death and resurrection. Listen for the one who speaks with hope and delight. Listen to him. Listen to him. Amen.